I'm Dale Smith for Linny Politics, and I figured we'd try and explain some of these protests across the country in under 5 minutes. Part of this stems back to way back to the time of Sir Wilfrid Laurier when he stopped doing treaty negotiations with BC First Nations leaders. That means that most of BC is what is considered unceded territory. That means that Canada doesn't really have a legal right to that territory, and yet we have since expanded our jurisdiction over it. And that's kind of at the heart of what is in this protest. The hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en people are technically still in charge of that territory because it hasn't been ceded to Canada by a treaty. Therefore, they are trying to exert their rights as title holders of that land to say that the Coastal GasLink pipeline shouldn't be allowed through their territory without their consent. Where this is complicated is the fact that the elected band chiefs, which are under the Indian Act regime and who have authority over the reservation areas, which are of limited jurisdiction, not the ancestral territory that the hereditary chiefs ostensibly have jurisdiction over. And therefore, while the elected chiefs are in favor and there have been referendums among the people about support for the pipeline, this leaves a dynamic within the Wet'suwet'en people about who really should be consulted with. The short answer is probably both, but that's kind of where we're at right now. What ended up happening was when the RCMP came in to enforce a court injunction around the protests and the barricades, that was when some of the sympathetic protests across the country kind of touched off. Now, a couple of things to remember here is that the federal government does not control the RCMP. They are acting on orders to enforce this court injunction. And the other thing to remember in kind of the nuance of this is that in the lead up to the raids on the blockades for these particular Coastal Gas ones, was that the RCMP had already found traps and fuel-soaked rags and blockades and barricades and support beams from bridges in the area had been cut. So there is an element of, we'll call it mischief at play here as well, and that's complicating the whole situation. The Wet'suwet'en chiefs have been asking for the federal government to intervene, but because this particular project is entirely in provincial jurisdiction, it creates a bit of a sticky situation because it is largely kind of like asking the federal government to step into what is the provincial government's decision. And that almost kind of makes it like asking your mother for permission when your father said no. So it's a difficult situation, and that's kind of where that whole paradigm is at. When it comes to the sympathetic protests across the country and the rail blockades in places like the rail corridors in central Canada, that again, the enforcement of those court injunctions are provincial jurisdiction and not federal, and that is also kind of creating issues. It has reached the point where the federal government is involving itself, in particular the two ministers involved in Indigenous relations are meeting with the chiefs involved, both in BC as well as the blockades in central Canada. But until the RCMP leave Wet'suwet'en territory, that could be the situation that we're seeing. Meanwhile, Andrew Scheer, for example, is demanding that the federal government order the RCMP to enforce the court orders to end the blockades, which is problematic because the government can't do this. And we don't want a government who can order the police force around, because that's kind of what starts happening in police states. And we don't really want that in Canada. So the other thing I would say is what I'm suspecting is happening here is that the federal government is taking a stance similar to what they did with the CN rail strikes. in that, well, people were demanding that Parliament be summoned and back to work legislation be rammed through. They gave it time for the two parties to come together and to come to an agreement. And that was probably a better agreement that could have happened than if there had been back to work legislation. So it sounds like the federal government is trying to create space for the different groups, in this case, to try and come to a bit more dialogue and understanding in terms of the need to take down the blockades and the protests. But we'll see how long that takes. I would also say that the RCMP and the OPP in particular are very eager not to create another Caledonia or Oka situation, which would inevitably make things worse. So enforcing the blockades in a more, or the court injunctions rather, in a more gradual and, consultative manner than simply coming in and busting heads is probably the wiser course of action, but we will see as these drag on for the next few days. For Looney Politics, I'm Dale Smith.